When I handpicked them up, I did use some other equipment. It's not moving again. Try it again. Aha. I did use some other equipment, but my basis was notes and a clipboard. So if you look at the notes, you're obviously not able to see them, but all of these notes were written in pencil originally because he was like, guess what? You're working with alcohol washes. It's going to wipe everything off if you use a gel pen or a Sharpie because it erases with that. It makes a big difference. So we wrote it originally in pencil, overlaid it in pen when we got in if we couldn't see it. And you can see a couple of yes or no circled, and the actual mite counts and drone counts were not counted until later. Of course, I also had to define how they were named. I was working with quite a few hives over 3 different bee yards, and so I needed to keep track of them. How I chose to do that was very simple. So you see an example of it here. I have Farmersville, Blue Ridge. I had another location as well. But essentially, if it was Farmersville, it was F. And I had a certain number of hives there that I split off of. And so they were F11 or F10 or F9. Those were usually mother hives because I didn't tend to do that. But when I make the split, I move their daughter hive to a new location. However, the name is written on the top. So if I move their daughter hive to a new location, it's still F11 because it's the original hive. But then if you take a look, you'll see A next to it. So they each got 2 splits. There was an A split and a B split. So you're going to see F11A, F11, and or depending. So mother hives don't have an A or a B. Daughter hives that began as nukes are going to have an A or a B. And if you see a little plus in between there, that is if the hive didn't fail. So if, for instance, they did not make a queen successfully. That happened once or twice. It was very interesting because the weather is so dependent on whether or not queens are going to effectively mate at times. So for instance, my first set of splits that happened in early April did great. They did beautifully, almost 100% queen take. And then my second set of splits, because the weather changed and was really bad, and it happened a little bit later, I got probably out of 10 splits, I had about 5 of them that didn't make it. And so you'll see where they were recombined. I chose to recombine them with their parent hive. And sometimes I would see a spike in mite counts as well, because they might have been carrying a higher load. It perhaps could be a contributor. But the other ones are, you'll see like BR, that's Blue Ridge, and that's going to be -9. And you'll see combined, nukes, and full original colonies. So I have the data for that. Now, when I talk about sampling, this is what I did for sampling. Essentially, this is the literal box I carried out. It's a milk crate. It had jars in it because I found out that an easy mite check works really well, and you can just dump it into a small jar. But essentially, for the drones, I took isopropyl alcohol, put it into a mason jar with a label on the top. Oh, moved twice. With a label on the top, which is difficult to see, but this is TXB, and then it's 6. TXB6 with the date on the side, or TXB0 with 620 on the side. And I would hand pick up drones into that alcohol because they die when they get into the alcohol. So I would hand pick drones to do that and cap them because that's by number. And then what I would do after that is I would shake them when I got into the house like an alcohol wash, put them onto a plate, and individually count the drones and individually count the mites. And part of the reason for this is because I talked to Zach, again, asking what was the best way to do this. And I proposed this idea, and he said, that actually works really well. If you put them in alcohol, the drone's body swells up with the alcohol, and the mites actually come off easier. So the delay was helpful in this case. So that is what because he told me that is how I changed a little bit. And all my workers actually were washed secondarily when I got back into the house. So all of them, I would take my easy mite check, I would pull my workers, which we'll talk more about in a second, and then they would go in a jar, and I would remix them whenever I would get into the hive, or into the house, excuse me. Part of the reason for that is air conditioning. It's hot. I do not want to be outside counting mites over a plate of alcohol whiffing into my face. I opened up an isopropyl alcohol jar and I went, oh, and I had like a flashback, post-traumatic stress. And I was like, I feel like I'm counting mites because just the smell of it reminded me of that so intensely. So I always took them inside to count them just because I felt like the accuracy was better when I wasn't under stress or exhausted and I had better, cleaner lighting and better conditions for counting. And it's worse than counting sheep. So you're sitting over a counter going 1, 2, 3, 4. So I hand counted every single alcohol wash for workers and for drones through this whole test. And I sometimes double counted them because I lost count. But it makes a big difference being able to properly categorize them. You'll notice it's in pencil because, again, if you put it in pen or Sharpie, it will wash off with the alcohol. It makes a big difference. For the workers, I followed a standard size because I did not want to hand pick up workers. This was agreed upon. I took the Easy Check alcohol wash, and I used the alcohol appropriately, and I filled up the bees to the same level every time as much as I could accurately. So I tried to get them about the same. And I can tell you, it's reasonably accurate. Between that first little line and the second little line in the alcohol wash, it's usually between like 250 bees and 300 bees on average. It does a pretty good job, which was very happy for me to know that they're giving me good information. So that was something that I enjoyed. Ironically, I knew how to do alcohol washes, and I didn't as a beekeeper. Not often, not regularly. And so this gave me a very big crash course in how to do it very quickly. And it is straightforward. For those of you who haven't done it, essentially you'll take your alcohol wash, you'll pour in your alcohol, and you'll lay out, I used a piece of cardboard. It was literally this nasty old gummy piece of cardboard by the end of this, but you can use a piece of paper. And I took a frame, I checked it for a queen because you don't want to put your queen in there. I did always try to pull from where the brood nest was. So where the primary number of bees were, the youngest bees were going to be, because generally that's where, prior to this study, everyone believed that all basically workers that were loaded down with mites were normally going to be in that nest area. So I just followed the standard rules. And I'd hit it on that piece of cardboard and go pop. And I'd pick up the cardboard and shake it in there gently. And people who make it look easy, they've had practice. It's not as easy as it looks when you first do it. And there's just a little bit of guilt. Now, the other thing is you want to be very careful about whether or not you hit a queen. I did more than 100 alcohol washes on my hives over the 5-month period that this test was. I only got one queen, and it was the second to last hive. It was literally the second to last hive in that whole study. So the 98th one, or the 99 one is the one that I killed a queen on. And I saw her and I was like, no, and I tried to pull her out. It was too late. It did not work. So just be mindful. Don't be in a rush when you do this. But then essentially I put it in the alcohol wash, gave it a swirl, and then dumped it straight into, and the reason I used it is for the measurement, but I dumped it straight into a jar, and then I actually washed it, mixed it for the prescribed amount of time that they recommend on the Easy Check. I mixed it when I got back into the house inside its little ball jar, and then dumped it onto the plate. So I did the mixing in the second half to hope that the body swelled and more mites came off for an accurate test. Some of the questions that I asked on the sheets are what you see. For instance, I asked whether or not they have continuous brood. Well, continuous brood could mean anything from eggs, larvae, pupa. I said continuous brood counts even if it's capped, because there were times I didn't have young larvae, but I had capped because of seasonality. For instance, when we hit the dearth in Texas, a lot of times our brood just kind of drops off for a week or so. So I'd still count that. Or if I lost a queen, as long as there was still brood in the colony, I'd count that, because if there's brood, generally speaking, there's often mites under that brood still, and that's why I counted it. Whether or not it had a queen, it's going to affect whether or not you have drones. Whether or not you had disease in the hive. I always noted that because it's going to make a difference overall in the health of the colony. And other things like, did you remove bees from this hive? I removed bees during splits, so I wanted to make sure that I noted that I removed bees because it's potentially going to drop your mite counts. This was really for my information. That didn't need to be in there because it was all just pure numbers about where the mites and the drones were. But having the big picture of what I was doing was helpful for me. It gave me better information about what I was doing and why. And it really made it valuable when I went to talk to other people about how to check for mites, how to do an alcohol wash, what's going on in the colony seasonally, and the differences, because I can look back at them and see when drone populations go up and down. I can see when they may have had a queen loss and how that affected mite populations about 2 to 3 weeks later when there weren't any baby bees hatching out. So it is really interesting to me. And also whether or not I put in treatment. I'll talk more about that later, but essentially I did choose to put in treatment right at the end of the study because I wanted to know whether or not some of these treatments that were on the shelf, how effective were they? What did I find true in my colonies? Because I don't generally just take stuff on, well, this is what the package says. I've never been that person. Now, after collecting the data, I was actually inputting it into Zach's system for a spreadsheet, but this is kind of what the final result looks like. When it comes into my computer and what it looks like. I've cut off the names and the locations because that wasn't important, and this actually goes further back. There's even more. I have medium, weak, strong to show, and it is really interesting to see the ones, if they're weak and they have drones, it means they're queenless always. So it's a wonderful correlation. You can see it on the data sheets. The important thing is how many workers did you pick up versus how many mites did you pick up? How many drones did you pick up versus how many mites were on those drones per alcohol wash? So every single one of them got checked. Now you'll notice there's some double zeros over here. That's important to note because we're going to talk more about what those mean statistically speaking in a minute. But keeping track of this data was also really cool to just see it laid out and to understand it. The equation that was used was actually just done on a spreadsheet. You can make graphs on Excel. I had to get some guidance from my father for that, but you can make graphs on Excel. And I'm very grateful that he took the statistics class that I took because I had to get some memory joggers out. And that would be my father. But one of the things you have to do is consider the data. So obviously the data was collected. This was 5 months worth of work. And then I had to compile it and I had to do something with it. What was I actually going to do with it besides thinking it was interesting to look at? So I'm trying to find out, again, the question is, are drones carrying the higher load? Well, whenever you're collecting data or putting it in a graph, there's certain things you're going to do. For instance, massaging the data. Sounds a little weird, but it is an actual mathematical term. I'm like, I know this one from my class. This is great. I can finally use statistics once in my life. But massaging the data means we're doing things to it in order to make it cleaner, easier to understand. And this actually, I'm going to go back to Professor Forsey, has to do with graphs in particular. A lot of times when we are on the news or on Facebook or on any kind of social media, they'll show us a graph of how bad murder is in this one location, right? And they're like, it's terrible. Can you see it? One of the things that they do is they don't show you the numbers on the side of the graph. So for instance, whenever you look on the side of a graph, there are actual little numbers right there. How big is this statistics compared to the big picture? And this is very important. So whenever you massage the data, you're making sure that this comparison bar is the same between your two data collection points. So essentially, this goes like, I'm going to make up numbers because you can't actually see them on there, but it goes from 400 down to 1 versus the next one goes to 80 to 1. And that's a massive difference. So for instance, if you're looking at those graphs that are trying to scare you as to how bad crime is or how bad things are going, you want to actually be able to see that profile bar because in the big picture of things, they may be showing you the 40th percentile rather than the full picture of the 400 percentile. And you can see that good behavior and less arrests are happening every day or something like that because they're not going to show you that. They're fear-mongering in part. And I don't want to do that. I want to make sure that my data is actually really good. So one of the things that I'm going to do is massage the data. I want to give you apples to apples. I want to compare the same thing. So I've removed zeros, I've removed outliers. I'm going to show you more about what that is. I've removed zeros, I've removed outliers, and I've calculated my equations accordingly. And the first time I did it, I made a massive mistake. And that's the reason I point out that particular little bar on the side is because I didn't realize I was looking at a 400, 600 percentile in comparison to an 80 percentile. And fortunately, a family member was like, did you notice this? And I went, oh, thank you for looking at that. And I found where the outlier was. Essentially, it's here, but I'll go back to that in a second. Comparatively, what was happening is, look at this. This is a 700 percentile right here. These are drones, and it spiked way up there. And then when you look right down here, this is workers, and you can't even see the rest of the drone graphs because it's so small, because it goes from 100 to 0. I'm like, oh, that's a big jump. That's not right. You cannot see what you're looking at because those outliers are throwing it off. And how many outliers were there that were throwing it off? Like 5 outliers, 5 bees total. And here's why. The test is whether or not drones are carrying more. So if you look right here, take a look at this. This is the drone test in July. I could not find any drones in this particular colony next to them. And so I couldn't find any mites to go with them because obviously there's nothing to wash in that particular alcohol wash. So it's a factor of 0. You go down here, look at the percentiles. You're going to see 250 versus 600. Ouch, why so high? How many drones was that collected off of? One drone and 4 drones. So on this data sheet, 4 drones were carrying 10 mites. Great for my study because I'm able to see, oh, wow, that definitely has an effect. But if I include it, it's throwing off all the rest of the data because it's not an apples to apples comparison. And then if I look at this, one drone is carrying 6 mites. That's where we're getting the 600% mite load on drones. It's one bee that's literally throwing this number off. And so we can't get accurate data from that. And so removing it, being aware of it is great, but removing it in order to get better data is what we have to do. So this is what it looks like when those big spikes are in there. It doesn't mean I didn't keep all the rest of the drone samples, but I had to exclude them because they were not helpful. So now I've excluded them. I've removed all zeros. I've removed outliers. So those one drone that's carrying 6 mites is gone. It's no longer in the data set. So this is what it looks like now. One of the things that I really appreciate seeing is actually what's happening time of year inside of these bees. When you take a look at it, notice I've got a couple little spikes here in April, and then there's a flat line right here as you go into the later half of April. Well, I can tell you what's happening right there. I split my hives in the early part of April, and I couldn't take good samples because the hives were all raising queens, and I had a bunch of virgin queens running around in there. So I had to limit my sample size right at that time. Now, of course, we're starting to see spikes again. As you go through drones, it's starting to go up. April, May, June, July. What happens in the latter half of July usually? Our honey flow ends. It flatlines. It dries up, it gets hot, and guess what they do with the drones? They boot them all out. So their population literally disappears. And so no samples. I would open up hives and there's nothing to pull. I'd only be able to pull 1 bee or 2 bees. That's where you saw like the one drone that I picked up that apparently had 6 mites on him. And then in August, nothing. There just weren't any drones to sample. Not of a significant amount. It's like 1 or 2. I remember being very frustrated. But it was our time of year. This is actually a common starvation time for a lot of hives if you're not feeding them. It's a natural time they don't have drones in the hives. They usually get a little boost in drone population going into September and October months because we get a tiny honey flow at that time. But for the purposes of the study, there were effectively no drones. Now workers, slightly different trends. Obviously, you see a big spike, but this is the mite load on workers, really high, higher than the drones. And it's because there aren't very many drones in the system. And then again, flatline, almost nothing. Because I was splitting my hives. I was asking them to requeen themselves. The mite counts were actually really far down because these were small 3-frame nuke colonies at this time. And so even the parent colonies were down to like 2 or 3 frames. So everything was split out really hardcore to make sure I made splits at the same time and everybody was about the same size because I was trying to make the numbers about right. Take care of the hives in such a way that it was conducive to the study a little bit. After all, I've made the study work for me. Now I'm trying to make the hives work for the study. Now, you can start to see spikes because this is the worker population. Spikes, but it's still quite low. What's in the colony at this time are drones. Now it starts to go up. One of the things you'll see right here in August is even though they're still present in the colony, which drones were not, look at it going down. This is actually my mite treatments right down there in August. So that's when I was treating in the latter half of July into August, and it has an effect on the mite loads because I did choose to treat, and I kept track of my treatments as well because I wanted to know what I found to be most effective. Now, this was the basic equation that was used to calculate the number of mites. Essentially, we are averaging them. That's all. We're wanting to average our numbers to find out what is the parasitic load per every test I did on all of the bees. So it makes a difference. This is it, the final piece of work put together so that you can actually see what's going on inside of the colony. Right here, you're going to see spikes. See, drones are in a blue color, and then the workers are in orange. So you're going to see spikes in April. Look at those worker loads, way higher. The drones really haven't gotten into the population as much. Flatline during that time, and then you start to see drones really pop into the population in April. They're way up there. Now, what I want you to take note of is it's at 80 percentile on that sidebar. This is an apples to apples comparison. So you can actually see the data clearer for lack of those outliers, for lack of the zeros, because it's going to give you better information. But you can see where all of these drones are spiking up, spiking up, spiking up as you go into July. And the workers are staying relatively the same. And then all of them tend to go down together. And that is because I have my treatments in, and I found them to be effective. So it's one of those things where you can actually see the data. So the question is, for the study, did we see a higher number of mites on drones? Were we effectively able to test them and get better data for how many mites were in there? Yes and no. So I would say that the conclusion from the actual data collected over a large number of hives is yes, drones are carrying higher numbers of mites. But here's the struggle with drones, is sometimes there isn't good data to collect. If there are not drones in the environment, in order to find out what their numbers are, sometimes you really have to hunt for the drones and they may not be there. But overall, yes, the drones are carrying a higher mite burden for the population, and then when they disappear, the burden moves on to other insects in part. They act as a bit of a buffer. That was the long-term effect of being able to see the data. And then, of course, they're bringing lots of different diseases. So to emphasize my principle, this is something Zach Lamas did, and I really appreciated it. I have a little plate of peanut butter M&Ms. There's a bag up there for anyone who wants them. And you'll see I have cute little yellow and brown, because they look like bees, M&Ms. And you'll see blue M&Ms in the mix. These are mites. These are representative of mites. The concept being, because I do really well with visuals, the concept being, if you're taking a sample and all your mites are spread evenly throughout your beautiful little plate of M&Ms in this case. So my little mites that are blue are spread all throughout this. Then if I just scoop up a percentage of this, I'm going to get a good count. I'm going to find out how many mites are in this. In this case, I'm going to say two. 2 mites are in my alcohol wash. Bam, I've got good numbers. But if all of these mites are actually clustered on one subset of the population, aka drones, if they're hanging out there, and I'm not sampling the bigger quantity of drones, then I'm not actually getting new numbers. And this happens a lot to new beekeepers when they're like, you know, I sampled my bees, I didn't see any mites, so there were no mites on my bees. But primarily they're sampling worker bees. But let's say there's 3 drones in the mix. Or if you want an accurate number, you're actually going to pull a sample of drone bees. And if they're the ones carrying all of the mites, you're going to get a better sample size, a better understanding of what is actually in your hive as far as mites go. So I've scooped up my drone bees primarily. I've gotten almost all of the mites, maybe 1 or 2. I have, you know, one little M&M out there that's blue, are on worker bees, but the majority are on drone bees. And I've been able to get an accurate test by testing drone bees, preferably testing drone bees over worker bees, because mites under this test actively prefer them. Of course, final takeaways, you want to make sure that you're aware of your mite counts. That's the real crux of it. They carry diseases, they feed on the baby bees, they do a ton of damage while they're there, and it makes a big difference whether or not we can actively, through mechanical means, if you're preferring to go what is classified as an organic route, but mechanical means or chemical means, that you're doing it right and that you're taking care of your bees with awareness of what's actually going on in your colony. Testing for mites in general allows you to have a better picture of what's going on in your colony. So above all, I would recommend testing for mites, because I have gotten so many people who are beginners who are trying to do a good job to take care of their bees, and they're like, well, the number one thing is I did not see any mites. So I did not see mites inside my hive. I'm like, they're a tiny, tiny little insect. You're not usually going to see them. Usually things you're going to see are like this decayed brood where they're trying to pull it out. They're cannibalizing it because it's died or because they know there's a mite on there. You're going to see deformed wing virus like is on this past slide. You can see these are my actual pictures that I have deformed wing virus and that there are bees with foreshortened abdomens. But that's not until your mite levels have gone to a peak. So the idea is head them off. Know what you're looking at. And thank you. I really appreciate you guys being here to listen to it. If you ever want to learn what my results were about checking on the types of treatments that I found were most effective, then definitely do that. I want to say thank you to Zach Lamas for allowing me to conduct the study with him, turn in my paperwork, and comply with all of the desired regulations for the Master Beekeeping Program. And also, I'd love to thank my family. My mom in particular has sat with me through all of this and checked my work and made sure my spellings were correct and has been there the whole time. And I have a lot of great people around me in general who have supported me and been with me and are cheering me on, so I'm very grateful. That's all. Questions?
If there's any questions, make sure you repeat it to the question.
How many times did you, I saw April, like all the way, or not July, all the way across. How many times did you check one colony?
Once per month.
Just once a month?
So the reason why you see a lot in July and April, because she asked how many times did I check colonies per hive. And I checked each colony once a month. It was just my standard rule. The reason you see so many checks during those is because I had all the nukes that I hadn't sold yet during those times. And I started selling them. And so you saw the numbers of actual tests drop down as you got later in the year. Yes, sir, Mr. Baxter.
When you were selecting frames for sampling, what was your standard for picking that frame and being consistent with that sampling method? Uncapped brood versus uncapped brood, or what?
So
why did you pick the frame you picked for sampling?
The question being, why did I pick the frame for sampling? Whether or not it had brood, capped brood, uncapped brood. So our data says that mites generally drop into the cell and hide in the food directly before they cap it. So about 8 or 9 days during their pupation cycle, or during their life cycle as a baby. Right before they cap it, and then once the bees cap it over, the mite emerges and starts feeding on that baby. Well, I sometimes only had the choice of brood. I always selected from the brood nest or the center of the brood nest. There were times I didn't have queens in the colony for long periods, for instance, when they were requeening. So I just took brood from the middle. So my goal was a brood frame, and one of the reasons for that is because whenever you do that mite test, when you slap the frame down on that piece of cardboard to shake it into your alcohol wash, if you take a whole bunch of old bees who are foragers, they'll just fly right off of that. You have to pick the young bees. So that is what I was selecting for. If I hit that frame and all the bees went whew and flew away, I knew this wasn't my sample size. So what I actually chose was brood. But alongside that, the frame had to be brood, but the bees had to fall down and show that they were young by not immediately flying away. So that was how I selected what frames I was going to do. Because also, if I hit that frame down and they all flew away, I couldn't get a good sample off of them anyway. So it had 2 reasons. Yes, ma'am.
When you test, I'm just curious about this part. When you're testing and you're wanting to see how many mites are on drones, how do you test your ratio just on the drone if you want to do that?
How do I test my ratio on drones? So that was with an alcohol wash as well, and then I individually counted them. So it wasn't quite the number of drones. I tried to get 40 drones every time. That wasn't always the case. Sometimes there was only 1 drone to find, literally. I hunted through the whole hive. I wouldn't normally give up. But how did I select the drones? I handpicked the drones that were primarily in the middle of the brood nest. I put them in the alcohol wash, and then I would count them individually. So sometimes there were less drones, but the idea was how many mites are on those less drones, because presumably the mites are also crawling on and preferring those drones even at that point. And some of the data, like those outliers I showed, where I had 600 percentile mite infestation on 1 bee, would testify to that truth. So even if I had less drones, the test would still potentially give me a result. So it was the complete set of numbers for the whole month and the whole year over several hives. So really, it was across the board of all of the hives that I was testing. And that's really what was helpful. Yes, ma'am.
I'm trying to put a couple of things together. So the mites are preferentially parasitizing the drones, correct? That's kind of what you found.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. And then you mentioned earlier that your queenless colonies would have drones in them.
Less or more. It depended on what stage they were at. So the question being whether or not my queenless colonies had drones. But go ahead.
So yeah, so I'm kind of trying to put those together. So do you think there's some potential, or did you see in your data that these queenless colonies, because we know drones drift, that these queenless colonies were kind of upping their rates of infestation due to those drones?
What I found was that it had peaks and valleys.
Okay.
So for instance, because I had a little bit of a visual on the data that I was turning in, and there's something that wasn't necessarily categorized. But the question being is, whenever you saw workers, you had queens that were mating, drones drift, and they might come into a colony, did you see that raise your numbers? When I took a look at it, what I would see is that there are certain timings in which a queenless colony is going to attract drones. And if I collected during that time, yes, I saw a higher level of mites in it. But I also got a bigger sample. So there's a little give and take there. I got a bigger sample of drones. So that could be skewing the data. It's one of the reasons it wasn't a part of the study. However, there are times when they're raising a queen and they're really small that they don't have any drones. And it's just an interesting give and take. It's not the same throughout the board. Yes, sir.
Just as a side note on handling the drones, did you ever actually notice on handling that you actually physically knocked the mites off the drone as you were handling it?
So that's a good question. While handling the drones, did I ever physically knock a mite off while handling it? And the answer is I think those mites hold on pretty well. I did not ever see that. I did move quickly because usually I was on a time target crunch and I had to go quickly. So a lot of times I was not looking at the drone to see whether or not it had mites, unless it was on the top. So most of the time I was just like this. I was picking drones off the frame really quick and dropping them into my alcohol from another hive. So I'd usually be standing with the frame on the hive, alcohol wash right there going. So I wasn't looking. If they were dropping, they were probably dropping back into their original colony. But I didn't see any mites ever drop off during that study. Now, have I picked up a bee that usually has a mite that is trying to catch a ride? So mites have different timings. If they're feeding on their host, they're usually under the underplates, right at the base of the belly. But if they're looking for a new ride because this host is eaten out, they'll actually be on the top of the bee with their little arms out going, come over here. And because of that, if they're on the top, you are more likely to knock them off. And I've handpicked up workers and drones to show people mites and seen them come off. Oh man, that one dropped. So yes, in other experiences, but not in this one specifically. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
In the colony that you have several drones and you are able to collect 40 drones, what's the methodology? You was looking for really new emerging drones, old drones, what type of age?
So a lot of times, because the question being is, what age was I looking for the drones? How old were they when I preferably picked them up? And the answer is because I was running a lot of smaller colonies and a lot of nukes. At that time, when I first started the test, I picked up absolutely every drone I could get my hands on because most of the time I was under the 40 count. So I just picked up everything, which is probably a better sample in the end because I'm getting older drones and younger drones all at the same time. And I continued that process just to keep it the same, even if there was an abundance of drones. I just picked them up from all over. But I would usually start in the brood nest because most drones are inside the brood nest for around 14 to 18 days receiving lots of food. And so because that is where they're congregated, that's often where I'm picking them up. Yes, sir.
So this is an interesting point that I'm considering as I'm pondering your study, smaller sample sizes, smaller colonies, as opposed to an established colony. So what I'm connecting in my mind, and I wanted to get your thought on, is the question being, if you're sampling small colonies that don't often have an excess, we'll say, of 40 drones, and you're removing those and killing those to do your sample, it's going to take time, I would assume, for the colony to regrow, attract new drones, drift, and so on. So I'm curious if you would suspect that the worker load in your study may actually show higher than a real world scenario. The question is, do you think your worker scenario may have been
skewed,
negatively impacted on a higher number because it didn't have a large number of drones?
So the question being, if I was picking up drones constantly, presumably the mites were preferably going to the workers, could that be skewing my data? And the answer is I don't think so. And here's why. I'm surrounded by beekeepers. There's beekeepers all over. You can drive, you can throw a stone and hit a beekeeper. I'm in Farmersville, Fannin County. It has the most beekeepers per capita of any county, 2 counties in the United States. But I think that drones would move in from other colonies, because even if I saw that they did not have any drone brood, I would see drones. So I don't believe it did negatively impact that, because presumably if there was a mite running around, it might take onto a drone. However, I don't necessarily have that information outright. Maybe I'll find out. Any other questions?
Did any of your research go to Dr. Lamas?
All of it.
To go into his, is he using any of your stuff in his?
I never asked, but it went into a database he set up for anyone who was conducting this study on their own. So I believe it did, but I don't have the actual information, because I never asked him what he did with my data. I was just like, thank you for taking it. That finding someone to work with hung me up for about 2 years, because I couldn't find anyone to conduct a study with. Yes, sir.
So question, so you mentioned you were also doing mite treatments as part of this and analyzing that. So that's in your spreadsheet, I would assume. So the question is did you feel like what you observed in mite treatments as it relates to doing your sampling, because it was frequent sampling, most beekeepers are not sampling frequently. So what was the results of your mite treatment as it relates to your studies?
That was actually really fascinating. So the question being, what was my mite treatment as it relates to my study? So I tested my mites regularly. Most people don't. They don't test before and after treatment. And what I found, the core of it, is that timing when you treat is so important, and what you treat with. So I did about 3 different types. I won't list them here, but one of the treatments that is not listed for being temperature sensitive is temperature sensitive, and it killed 4 hives. So they got taken out of my data set. Killed 4 hives within about 8 hours. So it was substantial. Like, I went out there and went, what happened? What's going on? And had to just pull everything apart. They were gone. They left. And it was considered a organic, natural, gentle treatment. And so that's one of the things that I was testing, because I had heard things about this treatment and I wanted to know more. So one of them just outright killed the entire hive. No data there. The other, I'm sure it was low on mites, but it was dead. The other 2 treatments that I used, which were acceptable, and I've used them before at different times, and one of them is considered no longer effective. That is not the case. It was still effective inside of my colonies, probably because my colonies are not commercial grade colonies being exposed to this chemical on a regular basis. My colonies, I carefully change up what I'm treating with. I only treat as needed. And because of that, it was still very effective. But yes, I saw that my treatments, the 2 treatments that I used that had hives survive, were extremely effective. I saw mite counts drop. But here's the thing that I think a lot of people get caught on when it comes to treating, is they only treat after they start seeing deformed wing virus and they start seeing cannibalized brood, and it's already really late at that point. And so what happens is it starts degrading the actual hive very quickly, and they can't recover from it. They're already overloaded with mites and with illnesses. By the time you put the treatment in there, people say, well, it didn't work. It probably was just too late at that moment. And I'm sure anybody who's done this for a long time has seen it. But yes, my treatments were extremely effective in dropping down my mites. And from some of the pictures that you've seen, you can tell that I have mites. I know what it looks like. It's not if, it's just how many. Yes, sir.
When you say the 4 colonies died, they actually died or absconded?
I believe that it was a little mixture of both. So all the brood was left behind. A certain number of the bees were dead in the bottom, and then absconded. primarily, but a little bit of both because the brood was all dead. So I would consider that a dead hive. And then a certain number of the worker bees were still dead.
Michelle has a few questions online. She could be here today. She has surgery.
Yeah.
But she says, do you recommend that we do more IPM around drones, such as drone brood removal? And the second part is, what do you recommend for beekeepers for monitoring their mite levels? So do you recommend them just getting a frame of drones and monitoring that way rather than the way we've been doing it?
So
do we have a threshold for monitoring drones?
Should I repeat the question or is it on
Yeah,
there?
go repeat it.
So the question being how would be the best way to monitor drones or mites through drones? Would you recommend using a drone frame? Would you recommend doing alcohol washes? And I've actually done drone frames. I would say they're a good way, but they're not the best way because especially operator error. If you leave that drone frame in there and you leave 2 drone frames in there and they're bursting out drones all covered in mites, what have you done? You've just overloaded your hive with mites and a bee that requires an immense amount of resources and care. Now, drones are incredibly important. I like drones. Drones are great. But if you overwhelm a hive, because their balance inside the hive is naturally only a 10% inside the colony. So if their balance is off, you're going to make the hive unhealthy. If you're going to use drone frames, you must be diligent about removing them once they're primarily capped. And it is helpful at that point, but if you leave them and make mistakes on it, you'll kill a colony. I've done it. I've done it to 3 colonies because I was trying that method on 3 colonies and I wasn't attentive enough. So that's the thing is you've got to know what you're doing. Now with checking drone removal, I would recommend if you have a high number of drones and you're in the springtime, hand picking up 40 drones and doing an alcohol wash on them, I think will give you a higher ratio and a better number on what you have as an overall. And I'd recommend anybody who's curious to try it. But hand picking up drones to find out would be the way I'd recommend in an alcohol wash rather than a drone frame, if that answers the question.
Could you just shake a frame of drones? Rather than hand picking 40 drones?
Shake a frame of drones? Well, there's not normally a frame just all sitting there.
Sometimes there is. Yeah, but
Sometimes.
That's kind of difficult.
You're going to get workers in the mix, so it again skews your data. So if you're wanting to test drones for presumably better data because mites are preferring them, then just hand picking up drones does the best. Plus they don't sting and it's great practice.
For monitoring the mite levels, should you be preferentially monitoring the drones rather than the workers?
And then there was a treatment question too, or no,
I think
no, she already answered that one.
Yes.
Was there any particular time of day where you saw more drones in the hive that you would specifically go in that time of day?
So that's a great question. Was there any specific time of day that I saw more drones in the hive? Because presumably drones like to go out mid-afternoon to go out on their mating flights. That's the considered time, at least currently that I'm aware of. Maybe Dodie will enlighten me to that. But they're normally out in the afternoon. The answer is I went in when I had time. And guess what? I was never making time in the middle of the afternoon in 100-degree weather. It's always hot. And I am smarter than that. So I'd go out early morning or evening every time. And presumably, because I also knew that drones prefer to go out in the afternoon. Evening or early morning was the time I was working every single time, just because that's what worked for my schedule. So I didn't have too much variation. Yes, ma'am.
So they were the same even in the evening as they were in the morning?
So
Like me?
I did not keep track of whether they were the same or in the evening or in the morning, because here's the thing. Sometimes I was going into different sized hives, some of them at different stages. I wasn't going to get a good, clear idea of that. So I don't know. But maybe I'll find out.
How late were you checking?
How late was I
6
checking?
o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8
Well, it depends on when the sun was setting. Generally speaking, the last 2 hours before sunset. No earlier because I was working. Just about supper time. That's when all the boys come home, right? Yes.
So I have a question regarding, with this study, I think it would have been very helpful being able to monitor a particular colony from start to finish with really great sampling regimen and treatment assessments and all of that. So my question is, did you find that sampling the drones and a correlation of hive mites on those drones for colony, we'll just say colony A, 1A, translated into an unhealthy hive later in the year and or a dead hive? So if you're found high mite load on drones early in the year, did that equate to health issues? Could you see the correlation?
So the question being, if I found high mite loads on drones during the early part of the year, would it be a correlation with a lost or dead hive or a hive with very high mite counts later? And the answer is I did not find a correlation, but I would phrase the reason why being that I actually treated. I treated, and that's going to throw my numbers. So even though it was getting up, and I saw some high ones, like 31 mites in an alcohol wash, 60 mites in one alcohol wash. That one was crazy. That was a worker wash right at the end of the year. And it was right as I had started my treatments, but it hadn't been in for long. And so that hive, guess what? Survived, it did well. The mite numbers dropped back down. It had an approved mite treatment on it that is currently people are stepping away from because they believe it to become non-effective. Guess what? It's very effective still if you're not overdosing with it. If your bees aren't exposed to it constantly at overdosing levels. If you're not a commercial beekeeper who has to keep everything exactly the same and treat every hive exactly the same. I'm a hobbyist. I have the privilege of doing this a little bit differently.
So follow up on his question, if you didn't treat.
If I didn't treat,
what would you expect?
I would expect a higher level. So that was a good question. Yes,
Higher level.
I would expect a higher level of mites in general throughout the entirety of the hive and potentially loss. Because I talk about treatment, I don't like to treat. I treat when the threshold is actually a little bit higher. But I know that it has, if I want to go the treatment route, and I've been an all natural mechanical beekeeper, and I've tried different things as they've come out because I'm curious and I want to know how they work. And I couldn't afford treatments for the first 10 years of me being a beekeeper. But in the last 10 years of me being a beekeeper, I've had the privilege of being the person who just treated twice a year and didn't test. So I know I can be effective that way, but I don't have good information. And now I'm at the point where I treat and test as needed, rotating my treatments and minimizing my treatments as well, which is my preference. And I think it's made me a better beekeeper doing this study because I now have a better visual on my numbers. I'm not afraid to do an alcohol wash. A lot of beginner beekeepers are like, I don't want to kill 200 bees, but it really gives you excellent data. And that's the thing.
So you're rotating your treatments using different products?
I am rotating my treatments. I use different products. If I do it twice a year, there are different products twice a year, different mechanisms by which they operate, hopefully. That's my core is the mechanism is the same. So presumably like the new Varroa strips and oxalic acid are one and the same. But so I won't generally use them on repeat, even though you can use the Varroa strips at a different time of year and they'll still be effective versus when you do the oxalic acid treatment, it's preferable that it's under 40 degrees and that you treat multiple times. And so because even though they're different, the mechanism of controlling the mites is the same. So I'm not going to use them on repeat. And I think a lot of people get fooled into that because they're like, it will always work, especially with every new thing that comes out. And if I know one thing, it's that nature has a way of finding out how to get around whatever you're doing, mites included.
So sometimes we see these spikes in mite levels
Mm-hmm.
where it goes from like 1 mite per 100 bees to like 20, and sometimes it's sort of hard to explain, which could be really the reason for this talk is that the reason we see these big spikes is because we're not looking at the drones.
So that's a good thought. Yeah, if we're seeing these big spikes in mites, did we just see drones leave the hive? That would be a great example. The other thing is did you just have a big brood hatch? Because 70% of your mite population tends to be underneath the brood cappings. And so if you had a big brood catch and maybe you're going through a time of year like a dry season, like what we experienced in late July, where the queens basically slow down or almost stop laying, then all your mites are going to be out on your workers and your tests are going to skyrocket. And so there's so many subtle factors to understanding how a beehive works and how these parasites work in concert with the beehive, because that is their food source. So they're going to be working right alongside it. So being well aware as a beekeeper of your biology and the biology of the mite and the biology and structure of the hive is so important and makes a big difference in your overall quality of understanding of your bees.
Yeah, and Michelle had a question about developing an IPM strategy around the drones. And so, like, should you try to develop a strategy like monitoring versus treatment based on like how many drones you have in the colony. And so, for example, if you have more drones in the colony, you should be doing more monitoring and treating during those times of the period versus when there's less drones.
So the question being, should we monitor and treat mites more profusely whenever we have higher numbers of drones? So during Zach Lamas' study, I'm going to refer back to this because my study didn't necessarily go over it. He talked about the number, and it's on the video that we have at the back. But he talked about the number of mites that move on to bees and bite bees as they grow and go, so to speak. So what I would say to the answer to that question, whether or not you should be checking or developing a strategy around drones specifically for treatment, not as much. And here's why. It's because the drones act as a buffer. They buffer the most of the hive from the actual parasitization of the mite and the diseases they're carrying. So they're carrying this massive load. It's not good for breeding. It's not good for other things, but they carry this massive load ahead of time. And most of the time, you're not going to see the effects in your population yet. And actually treating with a chemical or developing a strategy, well, if it's integrated mite management, maybe. But developing a strategy that involves chemicals, probably not, because you still have to treat the whole hive, not just the drones. But if you're doing integrated pest management, a lot of that is controlling brood as a whole, mites, drones included. And so it just depends on what you're looking for. But I would say check out Zach Lamas' study on how many mites actually move on to new bees. Usually in the first 9 days is the study that he circles around. So how many mites are moving over onto bees during this whole time? Because they'll feed on the drone and say, done, had my snack, moving on, let's go to a next bee. And that's when those bees, those mites that are on the top of a bee that you see are usually out there with their little arms out going, come on by, and they're going to snag a new host, is what they're doing. And that's why they fall off. Yes.
I'm gonna call that as the last question. Okay.
Oh, one more.
You're allowed.
I do have a question about the
Fine.
One of the most concerning results of the study was the drone fertility, right? And so I know you probably have different amounts of mites on the drones. Do we know how that impacts like drone fertility, like their flight behavior? Like, is it causing issues with like sperm quality, for example? I'm not sure Zach ever looked into that.
So if the question being is if all of these mites are basically hiding out on the drones, and the drones are bearing the weight of it, that the mite is potentially affecting things like sperm and fertility and things like that. And the answer is I don't have good data on that because it's not what I sent around. But I think it's a high possibility because what the mite feeds on is the fatty tissues, and those fatty tissues are actually what allows the bees to process things like chemicals. It's what allows them to have a better immune system. It's an integral part of their fat storage system, which is so tied to their health and their immune system. And if somebody's sick or not well, it is going to affect their fertility or things like that. And also chemicals. Chemicals are one of the prime things that actually causes infertility in just about anything, whether it's plants, animals, people. And so the adjustment of your biological chemicals are going to cause damage. And they've done this with fish, actually. They've put certain things in the water that causes more female fish to be created than male fish. And what it does is it causes these fish to be more tender and juicy for feeding. But what it is it's actually modifying their biology because of their surroundings. And I think, yes. Also, Juliana Rangel, I was at her bee lab, and one of the things she talked about was how delicate. And if you're going to be here at the beekeeping conference, you're going to see Sue B, and she'll probably talk about how delicate drones are outside of the hive. They don't exist outside the hive. They need more tender, loving care, and they're just a more delicate being. So they're carrying this heavier load, but they're not as strong as the worker bees or the queen bees. Like, you ship a drone and they're dead. You ship a queen through the mail and she's probably still kicking at the end of that shipment. And so it's amazing the difference because they are a much more delicate, simplistic, I might add, less things for it to be affecting, simplistic organism within the hive, because like the workers have all these glands and all these complicated things that mature differently with age, and drones just have their sexual organs and a couple of distinctive glands. But I think, to answer your question, I do not know. I do not have a study. Zach did not cover this as far as I'm aware, but I think it could very well be contributing to problems with fertility.
Do you know if he gets a drone in the future?
That's a good question. You'd have to ask him. Yeah, give him a call.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, everybody, for being a part of that. I'm aware we ran over a little over time. I'm sorry.